Multidimensional poverty dynamics, with time series and panel data. The good news is that you will not have to do this in your exercise, so that must be good news. However, if you go home and you want to do your own measure, most likely you will have to do this at some point. So one of the goals of having multidimensional poverty measures is to track the progress in reducing poverty. To track progress, you have to know how to compare. You have to be able to analyze the changes. Here we're going to cover, first I'm going to start with a descriptive analysis using time series data. Time series data, yes. But basically it's using cross-sectional data. How can I analyze changes over time in poverty using cross-sectional data? Different years, repeated cross-sectional data. Then Sabina is going to go to chronic poverty measurement using multidimensional data. She's going to show us a measure of chronic poverty using the Alkire-Foster methodology. Finally, we're going to go to subgroup analysis using panel data and time series. Let's see if we get there. So, what we start? So, in this section, as I said, one of the goals of having multidimensional poverty measures is to be able to track progress. Most of the data are repeated cross-section data. So you have different surveys that are representative of the characteristics of a population in a certain point of time. And then X years later. So we don't track individuals. We normally have two representatives and we compare. So what I'm going to show here, it's a methodology, something really easy, to make this type of comparisons. However, I'm not going to be concerned with some data issues that are very, very important. Namely, to be able, if you can compare the surveys that you have. For making comparisons, on the MPI, you have to make sure that your parameters are exactly the same. Otherwise, you might be catching changes that have nothing to do with progress, but it has just to do with your changes in the indicators. So this means indicators have to be the same, the deprivation cutoffs have to be the same, the weights have to be the same, and the poverty cutoff has to be the same. This implies going to the surveys, to the questionnaires, and make sure that the questions were the same. Also make sure that the responses were the same. For instance, and I've done that with DHS. Sometimes, even the categories of sanitation on the answers, they change. And actually, with that, there's not much that you can do. But you have to be aware that if there is a big change there, it might be because the category that they were choosing in one year was not available in the other year. And you also should make sure, be very sure about the structure of the survey. You have to know exactly how the sampling structure, the design, and see if they are comparable, so to see if they are representative of the same type of regions, and if you can make those comparisons. So these things I'm not going to talk about here, but when you go do your own analysis, you should be very aware. Here I'm going to talk always of changes over 2 periods of time, but the same could be said for 3, 4, 5 periods. Notation. We'll have a T1 and a T2. T1 initial period, T2 the final period. XT1, XT2 are our achievement matrix. It's just a matrix that represents the achievements of my society, of our society, in the first period and in the last period. This I already said, I'm assuming that the parameters are strictly the same. So therefore, in my notation, I'm going to just, although the M0, the H, and A depend on a series of parameters, I'm just going to put them as depending on the achievement matrix. All the rest is the same. I'm going to show you expressions talking always about the M0. However, the same expressions apply to the incidence, to the H, the proportion of people who are poor, to the intensity, and also to the censored and uncensored head counts. So I'm just not going to repeat, but it's exactly the same. I think I'm fine here. So, what do we start normally to? With what we start? We start with the absolute change, the rate of absolute change. And this is just the difference in the levels of the variables. So for the M0, I compute the M0 in period 1 and in period 2. and I just make period M0 of period 2 minus the M0 of period 1. That is pretty simple. Just tells me how much the M0 changed. In addition, we also do the relative changes. What is the relative change? Is the difference of the M0 in period 2, M0 in period 1, as a percentage of the M0 in the initial period. So, just to see if we are all on the same page, let's suppose that in my country, the head count, so I'm giving the example with M0, but you know that applies to head count, incidence, etc., was 50%. And the next year, it was 40%. So it's an incredible. What was the absolute change in the incidence in my country? 10. 10 what? What is the unit of measure? 10? 10 percentage points. So it was from 50% to 40%. It changed 10 percentage points. What was the relative change? 10 by 50, 20%. Note, it's measured in percent. So the poverty measure, the head count reduced 10 percentage points, which correspond to 20% of the initial poverty. Clear? Why do we need to look at both? And this is a question. Why do you think we need to look at both? At the absolute and the relative rates.
See the progress.
See the progress, but they both give us, in some way, the progress. Why do you think that the absolute seems pretty straightforward? So it's just a difference. Why do you think that it's the added value of looking also to the relative? The population size, it's not, the population size is already on the M0. Here I'm not talking with the population size. I will talk about that in a bit. Here, it's just I'm just dividing by the initial, so I'm just making a percentage of the initial.
You're comparing by the initial level?
Sorry?
You are comparing the initial level?
Yes. And why is that can be important?
Because it is not the same to go from 50 to 40 than to 10 to 0.5, for example?
Yes, exactly. So, in absolute changes, it's just a difference. So if you imagine a country that it's very poor, it has a very high M0, they can make big reductions. But if you have a country that has very low poverty, their scope for reductions is much smaller. And sometimes it might be much more difficult to make, not just the scope is smaller, but the same improvement might be more difficult. So if you look to those countries that have low poverty, and so you look at the absolute changes and you get a bit disappointed, like, oh, they didn't do much progress. But then if you look as percentage of their initial state, they might have made great progress. They just didn't have, they were already in a good position. That's why you should have both. So absolute is very straightforward. But with countries with very low poverty, you will have low absolute rates. But that doesn't mean that they didn't make impressive progress. That's why you need to see it as a percentage. Should look at both, basically. That's the conclusion here. Other thing. When I'm comparing different countries, and I think I mentioned this when we were talking about, we presented the MPI, we might not be comparing the same reference periods. So at the time I said, like, we're looking at Gabon, and it was a survey for 2000 and a survey for 2012. So there was 12 years between my two surveys. While for Tanzania, it was 2008 and 2010. So looking to the absolute rates or the relative rates, it's going to be very different. Yes, one has 12 years to make reductions, other only have 2 years. So to make comparisons, I have to annualize the figures. I have to look at their improvements by year. So on the annualized absolute rate of change, it's very straightforward. You just get the difference and you divide by the number of years. And that gives you how much the country reduced M0 by year. When you go to the relative rate of change, it's a little bit more tricky. And I'm just going to write here a formula so you know what I'm talking about, because you see that big and I should have put it in the slide, but I didn't remember. So do you remember the interest rates? So what I want, what I want is the M0 of period 2, that is xt2, is equal to the M0 of the period 1 multiplied by 1 plus the NR, that my R is the annualized rate of change, at which exponent? 1. So what I want is like to know what rate per year in relative terms M0 has reduced. So it's like the interest rate. And that is the formula. So what I want to know is the rate. To know the rate and solving to the rate, this is the expression that you get. So just that. So it's the expression of how much %, not in absolute terms, poverty reduced each year. That is the expression. What it means is that in each year, the percent will change. Because after 1 year, you reduce 5%. So the M0 went down. Then you reduce 5% of that second year. So it changes. But the importance is to know you have to annualize. You cannot just get and put the values because it might be very different years in between. Not this. An example. So this is an example taken from the book. So all that I've been saying, it's covered in the book in chapter 9, the 9.2. So here it's 4 countries, Nepal, Peru, and Rwanda, with different time spans. So all the rates are annualized. You have the MPI and H and A in the first year, an initial year, and in the final year. And you also have the standard errors that for now we're going to ignore, and also the statistical significance that for now we're going to ignore. Looking at the first panel, my question to you is, which country performed best in reducing poverty?
Nepal.
Why Nepal? Louder, I hear something there in the back. Yes? Percent, 9.1%. That's true. But it's also true for the absolute. That's why Nepal, there is no question. Nepal was the best performer. Nepal had the biggest reduction in absolute and in relative terms. The question gets tricky when I tell you which one performed best between Peru and Rwanda. What would you say? Rwanda. Why Rwanda? It depends. It depends on what you're looking. So the truth is that Rwanda had very high reduction in absolute terms. So they also had a very high, the highest level of poverty in the initial year. While Peru, yes, had a very small absolute change. But when you look in relative terms, in percent of their initial, they have made very strong progress. Not as good as Nepal, but very strong progress. So that's it. So that's why you need both when you are comparing across countries, because it's important where they start with. So it's important to have these two. Annualize is very easy to interpret and to compare, but the absolute gives you a perspective of the dimensions that you are comparing. Just to make sure that we all understand. So how would you interpret the 4.1 in Nepal? What does that 4.1 means? I would like someone to come forward and answer. Okay, so there is someone here. Let's see.
It's 4.1 percentage point that Nepal reduced for each year of their period.
Exactly. 4.1 percentage points. So Nepal, between 2006 and 2011, has reduced the incidence of poverty 4.1 percentage points per year. And the 6.9 for Peru. How would you interpret that? You are very quiet. per year between 2005 2008. It's just that. It's very simple. One is percentage points. We are talking about absolute terms. Other is as a percentage and per year. Not this one. Where am I? Now, just so you have an idea, for the 34 countries that we look at, when you look at the annualized absolute, the biggest, a question, yes, please?
So is it safe to say the relative change is the annual rate of change?
They are all annual rates of change, but some are absolute and others are relative. But they are all annualized because, yes, I applied the formulas that I just showed. So they are all annualized. Yes.
The only problem with the last one is 6.9. In the point, that one, yeah. If you talk about that, it's going to be discounted yearly. Year one would be higher than you reduce year two.
Exactly.
Then, except then this is an average then.
Sorry?
This must be the average of the years.
No, that is the rate that it grows each year. So the rate was constant per year, but that rate corresponds to a different magnitude each year because the initial percentage each year change. But the rate, it was per year, is the scale, yeah.
But maybe you could say an average.
But for an average, I have the annualized, which I already gives me like how much it was. And there is no average on this one because this is that rate. It's like the interest. The rate is constant. It's a per year rate, but it's a compound. It's a progressive, geometric progression. So it means that in terms of change per year, it implies a different one. But the rate is constant.
Yeah, but it's an average of the year. Yeah, because if we have each year less 6.9, we could set that it has a decrease of say 6.9 each year. But if we
Yeah, I could say that it's an average in the sense, yes, I'm just comparing 2 years, yes. So I don't know exactly how much it grew, yes. Yes, in that sense, yes, it's an average. I'm just looking at the two, how much it had to grow or to reduce to be able to get those 2 points. But in reality, it's like, especially if I'm talking about 12 years, probably there was some fluctuation. Yes, yes, that's true. Thank you. That makes it clear, yes. So the top performance, when I look at annualized changes, and please say this is on MZ, on the MPI, and from 0 and the negative change per year. You'll see that the biggest, the top performance tend to be countries where there is some poverty. So they had scope to increase. Nepal, Rwanda, Tanzania, Cambodia. So there are countries that had initial levels of poverty that were relatively high, not too high, and made progress. When you look to the relative changes, the picture changes. The picture is different. So the country that performed best, when I look in percentage terms, it's actually Armenia, whereas the country that had the lowest level of poverty. So they had an M0 really small. So any small change that they had was a big percentage. And so they, followed by Dominican Republic and Bolivia, they are the top performance. One good thing about Bolivia is if you see, Bolivia is among top in both. So Bolivia actually performed well in relative and absolute terms. Oops. Someone mentioned population. And so my question here is connected with population. If I look to Rwanda, and I see Rwanda has decreased incidence 3.4 percentage point per year. So the proportion of poor people has been reduced in this period. My question is, based on this information, can we say that the number of poor is also reducing?
No.
Why not?
Population is also
Population rate.
The population may be increasing. So exactly. So with it, I need more information to answer this. So the proportion of poor might be down, but if the population is growing faster than the percentage of poor is going down, the number of poor may go up. Yes, let's consider
4.5, population growing 5.5. Yeah,
Yes.
negative.
Fact. Exactly. That's exactly it. So it's in order to reduce the number of poor, my rate of reduction, the relative rate actually here, has to be faster than the population growth. Otherwise, I might be actually thinking that I'm making improvements, and I'm making improvements, but not as fast enough to compensate the population growth. So don't forget to check that. When you are doing your work, also look to the number of poor. In our case, Senegal, if you had seen Senegal, it was not statistically significant, but they had a reduction in the incidence. But they also have a high rate of population growth. So in Senegal, the number of poor actually went up in the period. In the other countries, no. In the other countries, they reduced incidence and they also reduced the number of poor. In Senegal, not. So be aware. Population matters. And it matters especially when there are like big shifts. Don't assume, no, the population went fine. There are countries where there is growth, a very high growth in fertility, or they are growing very fast. Sometimes there are crises that reflect also in poverty. Or migrations. So people move and you're looking, oh, it reduced, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking to the number of poor.
Sorry, about the population. I have reservation on population because probably if the increase is attributed to the working labor force.
Can you, sorry, I cannot.
If the increase in population is attributed to the working labor force instead.
I think the interpretation is made in such a way that population growth has a negative impact.
Not that. That's not what I'm saying. If that came across, but finish, please.
Oh yeah, population growth is most often than not assumed as negative. But we need to be careful whether the growth is attributed to the growth of the working labor force or the old and the young people.
Yes. I'm not saying that population growth is negative. I'm just saying that when we just are looking to the age, as I was doing before, we are not looking to the full picture. So we must be driven to take conclusion and say, oh, this country is making amazing progress and cutting poverty. But if I don't look to the absolute number of poor, they might have been making amazing progress in terms of percentage of poor, but the number of poor may actually be growing. It's just to be attention to that. And I'm not saying there is several reasons why population growth can be good, but I'm just saying that we shouldn't be too fast in taking conclusions just looking to ratios. We should also go to look to the number of poor. So that was just the point of that. So when we've seen when we talk about the M0 that we can also break down M0 by dimensions and look to each indicator, how the indicators contribute to the M0. And we can, as I said in the beginning, the same expressions that I have used to M0, we can also look at the censored and uncensored head counts. What's the difference? Just to make sure that we are again all in the same page. What's the difference between what is an uncensored head count of years of schooling? What does that mean? Oh my God, you're so quiet today. What does it mean? What it is if I have an uncensored head count of years of schooling, of nutrition, of 40%, what does that mean? Exactly, but all the rest, it does 40% of the people in the society are deprived in nutrition. And if I said 30%, the censored head count for nutrition in the same society is 30%. The censored. Deprived. 30% of the population in that society is poor and deprived in nutrition. So, okay, so that we mastered. So, but now I'm not talking about the censored head counts or the uncensored. I'm talking about the change. So what this graph here shows is the annualized absolute change on the uncensored and censored head counts. The first column is the uncensored and the second the censored. So an electricity, this one for instance, it means that the uncensored head count of electricity reduced 5 percentage points per year. So the percentage of people that are deprived in electricity reduce 5 percentage points per year. My question is, what were the indicators that have biggest reductions? And that is very straightforward. What were the indicators in which this society has made biggest reductions? Electricity and assets, yes. So similar, it seems that in electricity and assets, the censored and uncensored head counts have made good reductions. But now, what of these indicators, these 10 indicators, had the biggest contribution to poverty reduction? So it's not what the indicator has reduced most, but had the biggest contribution to make M0 go down. Cooking fuel. Why cooking fuel? That's so. It's important to look. So your point is that it's important to look to the censored and not just the uncensored. Other guesses. Other guesses.
But we should just
Yeah.
we should have also the relative one, because if they were low, like the level of deprivation was already low, but they reduced by a huge relative term, it could be contributing more than an absolute change.
That's interesting, but no. Remember when we do the breakdown, we are looking at absolute. We sum the absolute changes. Not sum the absolute changes, but sum. But it's an interesting point. I would also have to think more about that. Other guesses? Okay, I'll go. No many guesses. So cooking fuel. To answer to this, we have to think about the contribution, the dimensional breakdown. So when we did the dimensional breakdown for the M0, we said that the M0 it was equal to the weighted sum of the censored head counts. When we put this in changes, the same applies. We just look at things in changes. And here the formula is annualized change. So the annualized change in M0 is equal to the weighted sum of the annualized change in the censored head counts. When I say weighted, remember that there is here, what weight is this? Is the weight of each indicator. So what does that mean? That cooking fuel actually doesn't have exactly the same weight than nutrition. So it's not enough to look just to the progress on the censored head counts, although that is what you should be looking. It's the censored head counts, not the uncensored. But you need to be looking, actually I'm lying, we'll see next, that's both, to the weight. You have to look to the weight, because different indicators have different weights. So looking back to this graph, what do you think was the indicator that had the biggest contribution to the reduced poverty? The first four. The first four because they have the biggest weight. Yes, the first four. Actually, it was nutrition. Because the weight of nutrition, although cooking fuel did better, and even electricity also did good, and assets ownership, they have 1/3 of the weight. So nutrition didn't do as good, but in M0, it goes stronger because we are giving them 1/6 of the full weight. So the the formula, remember, is the same. But so when I look to the contribution, I cannot forget the weight of the indicator. So indicators made progress, and that's good. But for the M0, it matters how they enter, with which importance they enter to the M0. So if nutrition enters with biggest importance, a change in nutrition will also have a bigger, be more important in the change of M0. However, we don't stay there. However, this is mechanically. So we look at the formula, and the formula means that. Now, how can you interpret this? can I say that, yes, this country made huge improvements in nutrition, and so nutrition reduced poverty? It's a little bit more tricky than that. So mechanically, we did it. It's nutrition. However, what makes the censored head count of nutrition go up or go down is not just nutrition. The variation on the censored head count of nutrition depends also on the other indicators. Why? Let's see if I can think with an example. Suppose I have a society of 10 people, and I say that 8 people, 80% are poor and deprived in nutrition. And after a year, I say that this head count reduces to 70%. What might have happened is my question. What might have driven a censored head count to go down? And there is at least 2 different situations. Can someone give me one, please?
The first would be that the nutrition were correlated with another that was reduced and deprived, and that makes that person wasn't deprived or poor, and also it's not deprived in nutrition because it's not food.
I think. Okay, let me see just the one that you said. What could happen, to see if it's a person that was poor and deprived in nutrition, stopped being deprived in something else, in education, and it became non-poor. So it dropped from my censored head count. My censored head count went down, but it's still deprived in nutrition. Exactly. That's one of the things, because it's 2 conditions. It says to be poor and deprived. So it just went out of the poor, but it's still deprived in mentors. Exactly. That's one. The other one?
Maybe nutrition is just for women or children, and the population can change.
That's a very difficult explanation. The easiest one is no, the person is still poor, but actually is no longer poor in nutrition.
Yeah, but maybe the family hasn't 12 years old. The structure of the population.
Yes, and now, but in practice that ends in them not being no longer deprived in nutrition. So let's keep it simple. So for whatever reason, the person stopped being deprived in nutrition. So that's it. Or the poor person become non-deprived, and that reflects an actual improvement on nutrition. Good. But it might happen that a person is still deprived, but it's not. But because there was an improvement in education, is no longer poor. So that's why we need to look at both. We need to look at censored and uncensored head counts and see how they relate. So looking to flooring and cooking fuel, what do you think it happened in Nepal between 2006 and 2011? So there was a reduction in both, but the reduction was much stronger on censored head counts. So what does that mean?
Those people who were deprived and considered poor tried to use different type of fuel resources.
Less
Oh my God,
people were not deprived in that indicator.
Can you repeat?
Less poor people became less deprived
In that indicator, exactly. So it means the first one gives me how the deprivations in the society have changed. And so they changed. The second one shows me how the deprivations among the poor have changed. And they changed much faster. So what this means is people that went out of poverty actually were deprived in floor, and they are no longer poor, but they are still deprived in floor. Because if they all that got out of poverty were not being deprived in floor, I would see it in the society as well. So some people became non-poor because of electricity alone, but years of schooling, nutrition, but they are still deprived in floor. Because when I look at the society as a whole has not improved as much. So it's important to compare these two. It's important to see how the changes of the society overall went with how the changes and the deprivations among the poor. So to make sure, because when I look at here, I know that nutrition, electricity, they have been close. So there have been improvements in the society that have been translated also in the poor. The other ones, when they are far apart, is that the deprivations might still be there, but no longer among the poor. Some people became poor, but remained deprived. And in repeated cross-sectional, these comparisons will also be affected by other stuff, by the migration, demographic shifts, and also by the profiles of the non-poor that affect the raw head counts. And to finalize this part of the descriptive analysis, just this part, there will be more, to come much more. So it's very important for you, and this you are doing at the static level, to go to see the regions. So not just to look to the average of the country, but look to the different regions, because it might be that a country is growing at a rate, but the regions might be different. Some may have might be reducing poverty at a certain rate, but when you go deep to the region, the scenario might change. Is the poorest region reducing poverty fastest, or it's not reducing poverty at all? So it's important to go and compute the same rates of change at the regional level. For instance, Nepal, we have here the MPI of Nepal at the initial level, at the initial year, 2006. And in the vertical axis, how much it reduced in absolute terms per year. So 0.35, and here it was minus 0.27, it was in a table behind, per year. However, when we'll go and look to the regions, there is different situations. The less poor region, Central Hill, has reduced poverty at a smaller rate than among the poorest regions. So in this case, there is different situations, but there seems to be a good positive trend. There is the regions that are the poorest have actually reducing poverty fastest. So it's good news. But there are other countries that the opposite appears, so it's not enough just to go to the national. Then you have to see how that reduction has been across regions. And so I'm going to finish here. What it's very important to retain is you have to look at the annualized changes, absolute and relative. And when you compute the dimensional changes, the censored and censored head counts, and you look at the changes, be aware of what they actually mean. Be careful how you interpret those results. Any question? Please, Udoy.
The population growth issues, you said it is important to look into the population growth. Is there any kind of possibility that if we take the national population growth, not taking if in the censored metrics, if you don't consider the population growth among the poor, because it can happen the growth rate among the poor is higher than the national growth rate. Is there any possibility of underestimating the actual situation in that case, if we take the national? Because rich normally tend to have lower population growth. So do we take the population growth among the poor or at the national level?
We don't have information of the among the poor. So, but Sabina, please.
But also, if you think about it, a poverty measure is a society-wide measure. And so your denominator of M0 is N. It's the number of people in society. And H is the percentage of poor households. And so what, in a sense, if it's a society-wide poverty measure, you're safe. And you know the number of people in the households that you sampled among who are poor. So you weight up by the individual levels. And so I think that in that sense, there's some usefulness. What is very, very valid is that the sample frame, which is drawn independently, perhaps in 2 time series data sets, may be drawn from the same census. Say the census was 2010 and you have a survey from 2011 and 2015. If that is the case, the census may not reflect the demographic shift. And that is a big and very common problem. And so there you need to go to other data sources and read and think, because the data aren't going to speak anything about the demographic shifts. And also, depending what the data are representative by in terms of population subgroups, whether these are regions or ethnic or other social groups, it may or may not accurately reflect when you weight it up and you look at the changes of these subgroups over time. They may not match when you do a new census, the population rates changes of these subgroups. So there's a lot of details having to do with how the sample is drawn from the listing or the census or whatever, and the extent to which the lists are updated at the time of sampling that we're not covering. But they're standard, but you do have to think through them.
Thank you.
And actually, I think now we should pull for you. Because
other questions?
we can take it in the end, because you have lots of minutes. Yeah. So in the end, like, because Sabina will have to leave at some point, and so we're going to go next to the next material, and then in the end we can go back to the discussion.
So now for the anticlimax. What Anna presented, as she said, is going to be the most important for your empirical work. And those will be, I think, what most people are going to compute, looking at changes over time. But we thought we would give some of you who are working with panel data or are slightly more interested in theoretical or other issues, insights into two other things. One is the measurement of chronic poverty when you have panel data. And the second is the analysis of how poverty has changed by different subgroups of society. So I don't expect that most of you will use this in empirical work, so you can relax or whatever, but I think it can be useful just to know that this literature exists in case it will be of interest to others, even if it's not of direct interest to you. So the first thing is, what do you do when you have panel data? That is, you follow the same person and bug them every 3 years, every 5 years, and you have a number of waves of panel data of relatively good quality. We are not talking about any of the techniques of dealing empirically with panel data. We presume that you know that. And we are talking only about a fixed population. So people for whom you have data in every wave. And we know that that's a strong characteristic of the measure. But when we have data for the same household over multiple periods of time, how can we think of multidimensional poverty data? Or how can we analyze those data to illuminate multidimensional poverty? One is to ask, in a sense, who is chronically poor? Who is multidimensionally poor not once, but in multiple or even all periods for which we have data? And so to come up with a measure of chronic poverty. And the other is to identify, in a sense, the kinds of poverty transitions that different subgroups of the populations experience, which we call dynamic subgroups, and then analyze changes in MPI for each of these subgroups. So decompose, but now not by region, but by the type of poverty transitions they experienced. So I'm going to talk about both of these in turn. So the first is, let's simplify. There's a lot of literature on chronic poverty measure in income space, building on Jalan and Ravalian, many chronic poverty measures. And then there are a number of chronic multidimensional poverty measures where more than one dimension is considered. For simplicity, we're simply going to consider how to extend M0 or MPI when the data available are chronic. But the references to that other literature are both in the chapter circulated and in the background paper by Satya Chakravarti, Maurizio Apaplaza, Gaston Jalonetzky, and myself. So this actually builds on work that James Foster did in 2006 that was published in 2009 on a counting-based approach to identifying the chronically poor in unidimensional space. And what we have done is extend that approach to multidimensional space. And the characteristic of this is, first of all, it's applicable as the M0 is for ordinal data. And second, instead of being a dual cutoff approach, using deprivation cutoffs, Z, and your poverty cutoff, K, this is a triple cutoff approach in which we add tau, a cutoff of the chronically poor, which looks at the duration of, or the proportion of periods in which they experienced multidimensional poverty. So what I'm going to do is run through very quickly, using our very familiar matrix, how we construct the measure. So we begin with the G0 of K, that is the censored deprivation matrix, 4 dimensions and persons, 4 dimensions and 4 persons, with 2 people identified as poor. This is the censored deprivation count vector. So you're all familiar with this. The first thing we do is we construct an identification vector, that is a column vector, which records who is poor and who is not in a 0-1 frame. So you have 1 if you are multidimensionally poor in this matrix, and you have a 0 if you are not multidimensionally poor in this matrix. For those of you who use identification notation or have looked at the row identification function, it's simply the outcome of applying that identification function to the matrix. So this is for 1 period. Now we look at multiple periods. And what we do is we collect, we identify who's multidimensionally poor. This was the period we just looked at. Oops, this period. The last period, but we identify in each of the periods who is multidimensionally poor. So although this looks like the other matrix, actually this represents that person 1 was not poor in period 1, 2, 3, or 4. Person 2 was not poor in period 1, but poor in period 2, not poor in period 3, and poor in period 4. Are you with me? So it's a different kind of a matrix. And the number of columns is the number of periods, T periods, for which we have data in your data set, but it's still n, the number of persons, in terms of rows. And then we count up. Now here, what's different is we always equally weight the periods. This is complicated if your panel data set was after 1 year, and then after 3 years, and then after 2 years. There are other fancier ways of doing it, but the properties that we have specified for this measure of time anonymity require equal weighting of the periods. So this will always be an equally weighted matrix, and so you count the number of periods in which each person was multidimensionally poor. So person 2 was multidimensionally poor in 2 out of the 4 periods, and person 3 was multidimensionally poor in 4 out of the periods, and the last one in 1. Now, who is chronically poor? Are you chronically poor if you're poor in 1 period, 2 periods, 3 periods, or 4 periods? Fantastic, there's an answer. And that's a very clear answer, that all of them is chronic poverty. But you could say, no, you're chronically poor if you're poor in 2 out of the periods or 3 out of the periods. So actually you could vary tau to reflect different cutoffs instead of all periods. So I should have said that we name that column, we are counting the episodes of poverty. So we name it E for episodes. This person had 2 episodes of multidimensional poverty. This person had 4 episodes of multidimensional poverty. So we identify, this should not be K, we identify a tau cutoff. And let's say you're chronically poor by this definition if you're multidimensionally poor in at least 2 out of the 4 periods. And so you look at your episodes vector and you notice this person is not poor. And these 2 people are chronically poor by this particular definition. And tau could be 2, 3, 4. So it could vary just like K varies. When you have done this, then you censor the identification matrix. You construct a censored identification matrix Q. It was already censored for K. Now you have doubly censored it to reflect tau. And this person who is deprived in 1 is not chronically poor. And so you have censored them from the identification matrix. Okay? Now there's a trick, the only trick, but think about it. Now you have to go back to each of the 4 deprivation matrices and censor the deprivations of people who may have been poor in that period, but are not chronically poor. Okay? So it's a double censoring. So you go back to the G0 matrix, but you censor them of the others. And you are left with only matrices that contain the deprivations of the chronically poor. But you have a G0 of K tau matrix for each of the periods. Yeah? If you've done that, it's very simple. It's the mean of those set of the matrices is the measure. So basically what you have is, let's imagine 4 matrices in 4 dimensions, but it's too complicated, so let's look at 3. And you basically have a set of matrices. And you take the mean of the set of matrices. That is, you add up everything, 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this matrix and this matrix. And then you divide by, this is 12, 24, 36. So you take the mean of the set of matrices, and that mean is going to give you a chronic poverty measure. Okay, and that is the formula. You're basically taking the mean of each matrix, but then you're taking the mean of each of the matrices for each time period, each layer. And this is what you already know. It's simply the weighted, but the weights are equal in this case, G0 matrix. You can have weights on the dimensions, but not on the tau periods. Happily, there's a very simple way to explain it. So you remember that M0 was H times A, where H was the percentage of poor people and A was the average share of deprivations among the poor. M0 of chronic poverty is HAD, had. It's a past tense, you know, chronic, past. You were poor in the past. So HC is the percentage of this population, remember it's a fixed population, who are chronically poor, according to your tau cutoff. A is among those chronically poor people, the average intensity. And D is something new. D is the average duration of chronic poverty. That is the average number of periods or proportion of periods in which a person who is chronically poor actually experienced multidimensional poverty. If, as somebody said, you know, tau is 4, then D is 4. You know, everybody is poor in every period. But if, as we did, we took a cutoff tau of 2, then you might have one state in which people were on average chronically poor in 3 periods, and another in which they were chronically poor in 2.5 periods. So just like A, D varies between tau and 1, or tau and T, if you're counting. So between 2 periods and 4 periods, or between 50% of periods and 100% of periods. So that can be implemented whenever you have panel data. It reflects a number of axioms which include modifications of the key axioms we've discussed for the M0 measure, as well as some axioms which pertain to chronic poverty measurement. I won't go through all of those, but if you are interested, they are certainly listed in the paper. And as before, the axioms are joint restrictions on identification, in this case the triple cutoff identification, and the aggregate measure, which is the mean of the set of matrices. So I've said this intuitively. The slides show you how to compute H, A, and D for the chronic poor. But I will not present those. It's quite straightforward, actually. And I also just wanted to mention that you could also look at the other people, that is the people who are multidimensionally poor but not chronic poor. And you call them the transient poor. And if you add them up, you get the total population of everybody who was ever poor in that panel data set. So it's quite useful to do an analysis of the chronic and the transient poor. And again, the paper explains the relationship between those two indices because they walk in lockstep. Yeah?
I'm sorry. and if we define the cutoff as true,
Mm-hmm.
okay? If in the first two time periods, okay, I will make it short. Okay, if in the first two, yes, if in the first two time periods the person is poor, but not in the third and fourth, then we will accept them as poor or not poor when the cutoff is true.
So time anonymity is the axiom that covers this, and it says it doesn't matter in which period you were poor. It simply matters whether or not you were poor in a given share of periods. There are others in the literature who say the order matters and how many are back to back. And you can change that, but we've presented the simplest just to give you a flavor of this. And then if you'd like to go on, you know, the Nicola and Ray or the other work, then you can look at those methods. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll come on to that with dynamic subgroups. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Since we are dealing with panel data, and you know, year in, year out, year after year,
mm-hmm.
you may have drop in the population that you are tracking.
Right.
So how does that affect the chronic poverty, given
Absolutely.
that we are not going to be dealing with the same population
yeah.
Over the period?
So what I've done here is say that, you know, up front, we're presuming the standard ways of addressing nutrition. For presenting the methodology, we presume that we have simply limited it to a set of people for whom we have data on all time periods. And that will, for many panels, restrict it quite a bit, and then it may reflect its representativeness. So to go beyond into the other empirical circumstances where you can't have a fixed population requires other work that we've not developed. So we've developed the methodology, empirical applications using a fixed population, but haven't specified what to do to capture the others. And there's usually a lot of attrition. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is weights are assumed as equal in all years, right?
Across dimensions, you can have, as before, general weights. The WJ vector is the same. But across periods, it is equal weighted. If you have different weights, for example, the number of years between surveys,
mm-hmm.
then you do not respect time anonymity. But then also there are different interpretations of some of the constituent indicators.
Mm-hmm.
So again, for simplicity, with the first cut of a measure, we kept it simple and equally weighted periods.
Okay. My second question is, I don't know whether my second question is the same with Mehmet Sedat. Let's assume you have two individuals. One is observed as poor in consecutive years, and the other one is observed as non-poor, and the consecutive years non-poor and non-poor poor, transit poor.
Right.
These two individuals have the same degree of poverty.
So remember that identification of chronic poor is based on the episode vector.
Uh-huh.
So with what score will the first person have?
4, and the second is also 4.
Right. So in terms of identification in this, they will be the same.
Same.
As you know, in the literature, there are other ways.
Yes.
But you start very simple,
Okay.
and then you move out. And so we've started very simple.
Okay, thank you.
So can I actually move on a little bit? Because some of these I will clarify, and then I have to leave myself at 3. So I'll stop at 5 to 3, I promise. so that there's time for discussion, and then Anna can get all the hard questions and answer them. There are statistics in addition to H, A, and D you can construct when you're analyzing chronic multidimensional poverty. And you can do the censored head counts, you can do the percent contributions, and you can also do the average duration of each of the indicators. So there are a new basket of tricks for those who would like to work on this. And there are also period-specific indicators that can be used to analyze the chronic multidimensional poverty in different periods, so you compare who is chronically poor in which periods. What I'd like to turn to now is the second, which is the dynamic subgroups analysis. And this is getting a little bit to what you were asking. So let's say that there is one person who is chronic poor in the sense that they are deprived, they're multidimensionally poor in every period, okay? 3 periods, 4 periods, they're poor always. Let's say there's another person who goes in and out. So period 1 poor, period 2 non-poor, period 3 poor, okay? And another person falls into poverty. Period 1 non-poor, period 2 non-poor, period 3 poor. And another one moves out. So period 1 poor, period 2 poor, period 3 non-poor. So you have different poverty statuses in different periods, and you can identify that with your panel data having constructed for each period the same multidimensional poverty measure. And Anna mentioned that these have to be constructed with harmonized indicators, which in practice will take far more time than anything else. But yeah, so these are strictly harmonized multidimensional poverty indices for each period. Now, we might be interested not in creating a measure that, as you observed, collapses these people into each other if the churning, the moving out and the falling in are all deprived in the same number of episodes, but actually tries to capture what's different about their multidimensional poverty, and also looks at their deprivations in the period just before they moved into poverty, if they were non-poor, or which deprivation was it that bounced them out of poverty if they moved out of poverty, and which deprivations do they carry with them. So now we are going beyond looking at the poverty state to looking at the composition of deprivations of the non-poor and the change in composition of the poor who become non-poor. So there are a number of kinds of analyses that we could do simply with this descriptive information. And these are papers asking to be written very, very simple and straightforward, but really quite interesting because perhaps this joint deprivation of disadvantages has not been studied in precisely this way. So these are some research questions that might be considered. How do we construct them? Let's call them, let's give names to these groups that are slightly different. There's going to be a group of people who are non-poor in all 3 periods. There's going to be a group of people who are ongoing or chronic poor in all 3 periods. And then let's call the people who move out of poverty those who exit poverty, E minus, because they lose deprivations to bounce out of poverty. And those who move into poverty, E positive. They gain deprivations, so they move out of poverty. So they move into poverty. And then we might want to look, and this we can only do with panel data, at the proportion of people who are, for example, poor in period 1. And that will be the period, that will be the sum, if we have 2 periods, of those who are ongoing poor and those who are poor in period 1 but are going to exit poverty in period 2. And so beginning with a very simple 2-period study, we can go back to the panel data that we have and identify which people will be poor in which period. And we can also then look at the change of the proportion of poor people, which will be the difference between those who exited and those who entered poverty. That's going to be the change in your head count. The proportion of period 2, people in who are poor in period 2 in a 2-time period world is going to be the ongoing poor plus those who entered poverty. And now those who exited poverty are out of sight, so they're not visible in period 2. So these are very simple concepts, very simple to apply in a 2-period world. As you have a 3-period world or a 4-period, number of possible patterns of dynamic subgroups increases. Again, in this world, we can decompose changes in M0 to reflect the different, they are a weighted sum, as they would be a weighted sum for any population group. They're a weighted sum of the changes in poverty of these 3 dynamic subgroups. Okay, so now we're just thinking of them if this was the north, the west, and the south as 3 subgroups. Now we're decomposing them by dynamic subgroups. And again, we can look at changes in M0 accordingly. I won't go through the 6-person example, but I'll simply tell you what the example says so that you are aware of it. These are 6 people in the rows, and the columns are different deprivations, and this is their deprivation, their G0 matrix, censored in period 1 and in period 2. And what you see is in period 1 and period 2, person 1, in period 1, person 1 and person 2 were poor. But in period 2, person 1 and person 2 were non-poor. Persons 2, 3, and 4 were poor in both periods, but persons 2 and 3 lost the deprivation, and person 5 gained the deprivation. Person 6 was non-poor in period 1, but became poor in period 2. These are the kinds of insights you can get from panel data. And then we can look at the M0 in the 2 time periods, the H and the A, and the change, and analyze it in the ways that I mentioned. So in particular, we can poverty, the people who enter poverty or fall into poverty, and the ongoing poor. And we can see, for example, what percentage of the change in M0, which was -1/4, so poverty went down, but what percentage of the change was experienced by the ongoing poor? Remember, that's the difference in the number of deprivations on average they carry. So it's really their change in intelligence. Affected by those who entered poverty, thus causing poverty to rise, and those who exited poverty, thus taking with them all of their deprivations into the non-poor. And we see in this example that most of the poverty reduction was driven by those who exited poverty. There was a small increase of 3/36 or 1/12 who entered, and a very small decrease of 1/36 in the intensity of the ongoing poor. We could also consider the change by those who moved out of poverty and those who stayed in poverty. The ongoing poor were responsible for 11% of the overall change in M0. That's 1/36 and 1/4. And those who exited were responsible for 89%. Now, why is this important for policy? So a moment to wake up and think about policy. Let's say that you are taking the people who are barely poor as a policymaker and lifting them out of poverty. But there's a group of people who are staying poor or getting poorer, the ongoing poor. This kind of study would show that visibly. It would also show, as this case did, whether the 2 people who leave poverty are very, very poor, have a high intensity. You notice that these people are deprived in 5 and 6 of the deprivations, of the dimensions, so they were the poorest, and they left poverty. So that will also be reflected in this kind of analysis. So you'll be able, in a sense, to spot if they are picking people barely poor, the deprivations are just above K, or if they're looking at people who have a very high deprivation score.
Can this be tied to this deprivation be tied to the environment, given the environment? Why have the non-poor move out of poverty? What were the things? How do you know that?
So that requires, it's a very good question, if I have time, which I won't, but in your slides that I'll give you, there is an example where you can look at the composition. So what you do is you analyze the composition of poverty and how it changed, as Anna mentioned, but now with a panel data set. For example, just before what was the deprivations that I had before I was poor? I didn't have education already, right? I already had a bad house. But what bumped me into poverty? I lost my job. So my employment status changed. You can see that. And okay, I am poor, I'm unemployed, I don't have my education, whatever. What bumped me out of poverty?
You got a new job.
Yeah. Might be new job, it might be another deprivation. It might be maybe my daughter finished high school and entered the job market. It might be something else. But by analyzing the composition of poverty, you can't establish causality, but you can describe the deprivations of the poor and the non-poor, and those that changed and caused their change, in a sense, caused not in a causal sense, but as a measurement sense, was responsible for their change in poverty status. And this is the kind of analysis I think that really does have energy. I'll tell you the story of the rest of the slides. The rest of the slides say it would be nice to be able to answer this policy question of whether poverty mostly went down because people left poverty, or mostly went down because we reduced the intensity of the people who remained poor. When we have cross-section data, repeated cross-section data, which is what we use for time series comparisons, we are not able to answer that question because we don't know the identity of the households and we simply cannot see. So what we do is empirically we can fix upper and lower bounds using the data and the deprivation scores to fix upper and lower bounds in the absence of exogenous shocks about what those might be. And then we can empirically, in a sense, guess. But when we do that, we find a very large range. So it doesn't answer our question. We can also look at different theoretical approaches. For example, a decomposition that Maurizio Apoplatza did with Gaston Jelinek, where you make assumptions that those who left poverty had the average intensity, and those who were the average intensity, sorry, the intensity of people who were poor in period 1, and those who stayed poor had the average intensity that was the mean of the intensity of the 2 periods. You can make some theoretical assumptions and get a point estimate. Or you can do a Shapley decomposition building on Revalian and Hoopy, which Jose Manuel Roche adapted for a multidimensional environment and implemented. And again, with that Shapley decomposition, you can try theoretically to estimate these. But again, you're making very strong assumptions about the intensity and the identity of people who leave poverty. So we describe, first of all, how you can make an empirical set some upper and lower bounds and give some results using the same countries we've seen before. And we see that the bounds are very high. So the movers might account for more than the change or for 60% of the change. So you can't really see what drove change, except in the case of Ethiopia. No, not even there, except in the case of Senegal, where in any case the stayers had a larger effect on poverty. But the decompositions make very strong assumptions that we do not know yet empirically, because we don't have enough, we don't have, a database of lots and lots and lots of panel data studies where we could see the averages and somehow have empirical grounding for the assumptions that we're making. And so we can make a decomposition, but we don't know its actual accuracy, and so perhaps it wouldn't be wise to use it for policy. And for example, in this slide, we show the Shapley decomposition as compared with the upper and lower bounds, and observe that their conclusions can differ. And so In the example that we just saw, for example, where the people who exited poverty because they were very poor, they were responsible for most of the change in poverty. But if we did a Shapley decomposition, it would be, and made our natural assumptions, we wouldn't get that answer. We would get the answer that most of the change in poverty was driven by the ongoing poor. So I do this for 3 reasons. One is to sensitize you to the limits of the repeated cross-section data. The second is to sensitize you to the need, if you do Shapley, which is appealing and then you get a precise answer, to really think about the assumptions. And the third is to say that there is a need to develop an empirical base of studies that will enable us to go beyond this to the very interesting policy questions using repeated cross-section data, but we can't do that at the moment. So I will end there. And if there are a few minutes of questions, and then I'll hand over to Anna shortly. Salman.
This is not a question, this is just a suggestion, maybe you already know. There is large literature on this credit scoring. In the credit scoring metrics, we have all talked about different dimensions, biggest score, the credit rating, and how the probability of default conditions. So we are applying some similar techniques for their focus group is not the poverty group, their focus group is affluent group that who will not fall into this kind of. So maybe some of the mathematics will apply, not the data, because the data, they have more frequent data in the financial markets. But the matrices that we are talking about, maybe some insights can be obtained from there.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. I don't know that literature, and it would be good to know it, but also if you have insights on this, or that would be very interesting. Yeah.
What would be this terminology of chronic poverty appears in the poverty literature, but I know that really maybe in economic terms, you can talk about sustainable growth or sustainable something, provided maybe there is a history of consistency in the growth rate, but not like you move up, next year you go down, you move up again, there is no consistency in the growth rate. Chronic poverty, is it like that? Because the example that you've given, it looks like I can be poor and go above the poverty line again, deprivation, move again, and this is all counted. But really in economic terms, growth, constant growth means, on a sustainable basis mean, you have to maintain certain number, you are 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. But you cannot be really 5, then you go to 6, then you come down to 5 again. That inconsistency is not really regarded as sustainable. So if we are, I would have thought that maybe chronic poverty would really be maybe being poor for a reasonable period of time. I think it would be relevant. Okay.
Yeah, I would have 2 responses to that. First of all, that's a normative point, that it really should be continuous periods, and that point taken, that's, please go in that direction if that's what you, or choose a tau which is like that. I think the other question, however, is that the Voices of the Poor study and then the subsequent work that Deep and Raya did was on moving out of poverty. And there was a lot of visibility. The Chronic Poverty Research Centre here in the UK, they took a unidimensional definition of chronic poverty, but did a very, very rich set of both empirical, quantitative and qualitative studies. And it is a very interesting and very difficult group of people. And so I think honing in, understanding, their circumstances and how to eradicate that kind of poverty is quite important. But I think the other thing, we talk about chronic multidimensional poverty and measure it, but for example, in terms of the global MPI, Slovenia, Slovakia, and this year, Belarus, one other country, or Serbia, I don't remember which, graduated to 0 poverty. And so it's not necessary, depending which poverty measure you use, that there would always be chronic poverty. But it certainly depends on the design. So I know you've been very kind to me in saving your difficult questions to Anna. So I'm very pleased that Anna will come back and answer.
Thank you. My question is not a difficult one, but it's just that I'm a bit confused.
at the point where you calculate the chronic poverty matrix, at that point where you're able to get those that identify as chronic poor, then you go back and censor the matrix for the years that you have. Probably you have for year 1 and maybe you have for year 2. Then you go back to censor those that have been identified as chronic poor. Then there is another part where you have to do the summation. I think she has like 3 summations there. Aha.
At least I found the slide.
At this point, when you are done doing the summation, because you do summation for the first year, right? After you've censored those that identify as chronic poor, you do for the second too. What happens to the chronic poor matrix? I don't know whether you get my question. The question I'm asking, you are using the matrix that you get for the chronic poor household, something like that.
So the first you have the identification matrix, where it's counting, it's putting ones in the periods where individuals were poor, multidimensional poor. And based on this identification matrix, you identify who is chronically poor. So that's what you said. And then I go to imagine that I have 4 periods, I go to the 4 deprivation matrix, and I take all the ones, all the deprivations of those that were not chronically poor. So I will have 4, this year they are just 3, but suppose 4 years, 4 deprivations matrix, there will be only ones on the deprivations of the people who are chronically poor. Then I sum all these ones and I divide by the total number of entries on those 4 matrices. And that's what this is here, because it's the number of people, the periods multiplied by the number of dimensions multiplied by the number of people. So it's the average of all the 4 matrices, but they are different matrices, one for each year.
Thank you. I just have one question about one method that I hear about synthetic panels. Because we don't have cross-section, we can construct synthetic panel. I don't know if that is being accepted. And the second question is,
can you repeat the first question, but I'm not sure I
yeah, because we just have cross-section databases, we cannot see the same people over the time. There are one method that is synthetic panels that people construct in base of that cross-section databases.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And the second is about poverty. Maybe this was explained, but I didn't understand well. It's supposed that the poverty of rate is the same in 3 years, for example, but the poverty rate.
The poverty rate is the same in 3 years. Okay.
Exactly. But what happened with the poorest people? The population grow up, and the population usually grow up between the poorest, because the household who is poorest have more children. Then then when I see the poverty rate growing up, it's growing up more between the one group, because it is showing me the rate of the growth of the population.
Yes,
rate.
Exactly.
I didn't understand well.
So in the denominator, it's going to still be the full population. So, and as we identify, even if we identify the household, then when we aggregate, it's the percentage of people. So the if my poverty remains, if my incidence remains the same, the percentage of people will always, it's going to be this. It means that the population didn't matter there, because it's in the end, I'm looking to the percentage of people, so that I'm taking account in my denominator. So if that was the case, my incidence should have been going up. So it means that I had more people growing on the bottom, but that would make I would capture that with the age. If that was so different that it would make that the percentage of people who are in poor households are growing, I capture that with my age, because when I divide, I don't divide by the number of households, I divide by the number of people. I identify the poor at the household, but I divide by the number of people.
Okay, then that means that I'm measuring the population growth, right?
You are taking that, you're not measuring the population growth, but you are taking into account into your measure, yes.
My question is based on the cut-off points that we have. Remember, we have, let's say we have time, you have got the first, let's say our time is over 4. Let's say our time is 4, that you have year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And then in our indicators that we have, let's say we have income. But then when it goes to cut-off point, let's say one of the indicator is income, but then when it goes to cut-off points, we are saying that you need to earn a certain income for you to be deprived in income. So my question is, do we use the same cut-off point throughout the years? And if we have income as one of our indicators, do we need to adjust for that? Thanks.
That's actually a good question. Not about the methodology, but about the indicators. So no, we are assuming that the indicators are defined exactly the same. So exactly the same, and that means exactly the same cutoff. Now you're raising, oh, but maybe the money in the past doesn't mean as much as the money in the present. That's a good question. For that, I don't have a good answer. I don't know, we don't work with the income, but I understand your point. So you were saying to be exactly the same, I should make it at purchase powers. Yes, that's a good question for which I don't have a good answer. So the ideal is that the cutoffs should be the same to avoid biasing your analysis on it, because the indicators have changed. What you're saying is like, to avoid that kind of bias, I should use an adjusted. It's a good point. But
and the question are, I think, in the same direction of Yesenia. The first one is that what happened, for example, we have a panel, but the 25% of the sample rotates, and what can, the sample have a rotation of 25% per year, each year. In Costa Rica, for example, we have a panel, but it has a rotation of 25%.
So it means that like 25% of my panel will change?
Yeah. Okay. And the second one is that I think that could be possible, that we, we can get the poverty, the household, poverty household, and maybe after we can assign or put also the number, the one, for each household by the tag of the cluster or the ID of each household, and after we can get the people who was poor and people by member.
I don't know if I understood.
No, it's just a clarification. I'm just clarifying that maybe we can assign the 1 or 0 to of the household to each member.
But it's how we do it. So when you do it now in status, so let's forget about the times and let's think about the moment, while the population. Yeah, you have each row in your data set is an individual, and although you compute the indicators at the household level, each individual will have the indicator of the household, and that's why they are there. I'm not looking to the households. When I create the indicators, yes, and I identify, but my data set is all the individuals. Excellent. On the first question, on the panel, I think you need to have to apply the methodology that Sabina presented. You have to have the individuals, the same individuals. You have to have, or if there's You have to have everyone for who you have data, X numbers of data. If they come again in 4 years, maybe you will have everyone in 4 years.